How do you make the world a more just and peaceful place? Where did you learn to become a U.S. diplomat? What did peace-building efforts look like in post-apartheid South Africa in the 90s? The Honorable Aaron S. Williams, former Peace Corps Director and Senior Advisor Emeritus at RTI International, answers these questions and more. I'm your host, Hadeil Ali. Welcome to Driving Impact.
Driving Impact, an exclusive insight into the personal backgrounds and careers of trailblazers on the front lines of policy.
Welcome, Aaron. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm glad to be here today at CSIS. It's a real pleasure. I've always enjoyed my time here.
Pleasure to host you here today. Aaron, let me start out by asking you, what did 10-year-old Aaron Williams want to be when he grew up?
10-year-old Aaron Williams. Well, I grew up on the south side of Chicago, a working class family. My father worked at the General Post Office, and my mother was a dental assistant and secretary. And I was always focused on education because my parents thought education was absolutely essential. My mother was laser-like focused on education. As a matter of fact, I went to 4 different elementary schools in the public school system in Chicago, as my mother constantly sought out the best teachers. So my role models and what I thought I wanted to be when I grew up was a teacher. I saw a lot of good teachers in Chicago. My mother reinforced that. We had great respect for teachers in our household, and so I thought there couldn't be anything better than to be a teacher when I grew up.
And you were a teacher for a little bit, is that right?
I was a teacher for a little bit in Chicago, that's right. Yeah. And I've always taught throughout my career in business, government, and in the nonprofit sector. I've continued to lecture and teach, and I'm an adjunct professor at a couple of universities right now.
And what did you teach out of curiosity?
Geography.
Geography.
And that led me to my career, actually.
Yeah. And you've had such a fascinating career with over 20 years working in the Foreign Service. And Aaron, you talked a little bit about your background growing up in the south side of Chicago, but also being the first in your family to attend college. How did that unique background both inform but also shape your trajectory as a diplomat? Well,
I think that I learned my initial diplomatic skills on the south side of Chicago as I maneuvered my way through different neighborhoods, different gangs, trying to make sure that nobody took my lunch money at school. I was very much involved in sports, baseball and basketball. That was always a good thing to do because that gave you, number one, people respected you if you could play ball. And secondly, it gave you access to a lot of different groups. And so I think my early diplomatic skills were honed on the south side of Chicago. And it turned out to be something very important in my career, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Also, I was involved in different kinds of activities to keep me off the streets. I was in Boys and Girls Club, Boy Scouts, the YMCA. I got involved in a number of youth leadership activities, which really, gave me a good perspective and a chance to see a cross section of people in Chicago.
I can definitely relate to the sports fees that you mentioned, Aaron. I played tennis growing up and ended up playing tennis in college as well. And it really does teach you tremendous skills that you can utilize in your professional career.
So you obviously were very good.
Maybe. Have you played tennis?
I played tennis a lot, yeah, but I wasn't as good as you were. I didn't play in college.
Yeah, but maybe we can play sometime.
We'll find out.
So Aaron, you were a Peace Corps volunteer, but what people know you for is being the Peace Corps Director from 2009 to 2012. But actually years before that, you were a Peace Corps volunteer in the Dominican Republic, if I'm not mistaken. Could you tell us a little bit about how was it like starting off as a volunteer in the organization and then coming back years later to ultimately lead this prestigious organization?
Well, first of all, the Peace Corps was transformative for me. It changed everything in my life, and everything that I've done career-wise and in terms of my personal life and my family emanated from Peace Corps service. So I made a decision that I was going to become a Peace Corps volunteer, and I had to keep it secret because in my circle of people in Chicago, nobody thought that was a good idea. I'm the first person to graduate from college. Now I'm going to go off and volunteer in some place that nobody even knows where it is, the Dominican Republic. I vaguely knew that we had invaded the Dominican Republic in '65. And but I just thought I was very young when President Kennedy was president, and I had heard some of his speeches, and I just thought this was a chance to serve your country, to learn about a new culture, to learn a new language, and I just thought it was a great idea. But fortunately for me, my mother thought it was a great idea, and she had a weighted vote in my family. So I joined the Peace Corps, and so I arrived at San Diego State College in my training. I'm a group of 100. I'm the only African American in the group. And I quickly found out that I was with a great group of people. People who were idealistic, who wanted to make the world a better place. We bonded quite quickly in training. And it was apparent to me right away that this was the right decision. And so I went to the Dominican Republic. I was a teacher trainer because I was a certified teacher in Chicago, and I was tested right away. I was 19 years old, and I was given responsibility for 20 teachers. I was going to help them gain their high school diploma, rural school teachers who only had a 6th, 8th grade education, and improve their teaching techniques. So it was a very serious endeavor. They sacrificed their summers and their weekends to go through this special plan. And so I had to assume this responsibility. I had to learn Spanish fluently in order to be effective. And so it was a real challenge. And I learned a lot about myself in ways that I never would have imagined, as most Peace Corps volunteers will tell you they did.
So it seems like your mom was supportive all throughout, even when others weren't.
That's
she
right.
was supporting you throughout.
She was the one who said, this sounds like a good idea. And who knew? She'd never traveled outside the United States. Of course, later when I was a Foreign Service officer, she traveled to all of my overseas assignments. Wow. And so she had a chance to enjoy my career also.
Yeah. So when you were a Peace Corps volunteer in Dominican Republic, Aaron, did you ever imagine the possibility of leading this organization years later? Did you aspire to do that? I
never imagined that I would one day have the privilege and the honor of being director of the Peace Corps, because the Peace Corps transformed my life. I met my wife in the Dominican Republic, and later on my son became a Peace Corps volunteer in Nicaragua when I was director. First time, as a matter of fact, we made a little history. That was the first time in the history of the Peace Corps that a sitting director had a son or daughter serving in the Peace Corps.
Oh, wow. We did a lot of research ahead of this conversation. I did not know that piece of information. That's really great to hear. So, Aaron, talking about the mission of the Peace Corps, peace building, cultural exchange, what do you think is one of the most important contributions that the Peace Corps has made to this mission?
Well, I think, first of all, for 60 years now, right? When I was director, we were celebrating the 50th anniversary. For 60 years, Peace Corps has promoted world peace and friendship in a world that desperately needs that. And it also provides a way for people in countries where Peace Corps volunteers serve to see an authentic America, not somebody from on a DVD or in the news or in a magazine, but somebody who lives with you, who speaks your language, understands and appreciates and respects your culture, someone who works side by side with you, whether it's teaching in schools, teaching STEM classes, or working in HIV/AIDS awareness and prevention in clinics in rural areas, working with people to try to maintain a better environment for farmers, for fishermen, teaching English as a second language, doing the kinds of things that make a difference in the lives of ordinary people and showing an authentic American. That's what Peace Corps has been doing for 60 years.
And when you say authentic America, Aaron, this makes me think about also the diversity of America as well. Right.
Well, that's an important part of it because, when I first arrived in the Dominican Republic, very few people thought that I was American. They had never seen a black American in any position of responsibility, and certainly very few outside of maybe soldiers representing the United States of America. And so it was a chance for me to provide a glimpse of an authentic America, right? And Peace Corps continues to do this. Our diversity, our rich American diversity, is really highlighted among Peace Corps volunteers.
Absolutely. And during your time at the Peace Corps, Aaron, one of your many legacies was the work that you did specifically in improving protections for Peace Corps volunteers that were victims of sexual assault. This, as I can imagine, was a very, very challenging process. What was the source of inspiration throughout that?
Well, first of all, Peace Corps is always concerned about the safety and security of our volunteers. And as a director, that's your primary concern. So I was surprised when we had this major news story about the sexual assault of Peace Corps volunteers, and the fact that many volunteers over decades have felt they had not been treated compassionately by Peace Corps after the assault. So I was determined to bring to bear all the resources and information that we could compile and bring forward to make sure that Peace Corps became the kind of organization that would respond to this in an appropriate way. So I was fortunate that we looked at what were the large federal agencies that had been dealing with sexual assault. And of course, in our country, that's the U.S. Army. And fortunately, I met this outstanding leader, General Barry Price, who was at that time the head of HR in the Pentagon for the U.S. Army. And he offered me the services that they had been using to address this issue in the military, which of course is a very different issue for military versus the Peace Corps volunteers, but still the wide array of experts in-house and also externally, he availed those to me. He made those available so that I could tap into those resources. Then the other thing we did is that we appointed the first victims advocate in the Peace Corps. We also entered into an agreement with RAIN, which is the largest organization that combats sexual assault and violence in America. And they provided a wide range of services and different types of training and technical assistance that really was a major factor in our ability to put together a modern responsive program. We also worked with the Congress, with the White House, to determine what kind of legislation. And at the end of the day, the Congress and the President codified many of the reforms that we put in place. And I'm really proud about what we did, what my staff did in terms of training volunteers, our staff, changing the way we looked at that and made Peace Corps a really modern, forward-leaning standard bearer for this type of activity.
Yeah. And you were able to gain bipartisan support on this issue, right?
We were. Yeah, I made it my mission to engage with both sides of the aisle, the Democrats and Republicans, on this issue, and they were very responsive, and it made all the difference in the world. The bipartisan support was crucial.
Absolutely. Now, Aaron, we ask all our guests on the show to bring a memento, something symbolic that captures a pivotal or meaningful moment in their career. So why don't you tell us what you brought here today?
Well, there before you is an ostrich egg, which has painted on its side a cheetah and miniature elephant tusk. And my staff gave that to me when I was a mission director in South Africa because they knew how much I enjoyed traveling with my family on safaris. And so I had that in my office. It's always a great conversation piece, right, for anybody who visited my office during my time in South Africa.
Absolutely. And it's a beautiful piece. So thank you for sharing that with us. So as you just said, Aaron, you were the mission director to South Africa during Nelson Mandela's presidency. What was that like being an African-American representing the United States? And Aaron, we just talked about this idea of authentic America and what does that mean in South Africa at this time particularly? Well,
to provide some context. So I'm in South Africa leading the USAID program at a time of the President Nelson Mandela in his administration. And President Mandela had a marvelous friendship and partnership with President Clinton. And all members of our cabinet visited South Africa during the Mandela years. So it was an environment where a lot could be done to support the democratic transformation of that country. And the USAID program, our strategy and our focus was aimed at supporting President Mandela in that democratic transformation. Also, it was a time when here we are in a country where we have two Nobel laureates. We have President Mandela, and we also have Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which AID also supported and worked closely with. So it was a time when South African leaders recognized the involvement of the black community of America in the anti-apartheid movement. The Black Caucus had led the way in trying to free Nelson Mandela when he was in prison for decades. And also combating apartheid. So it was a very privileged time, I would say, as a black American to be in a country where they recognized what your community had done to contribute to this democratic transformation.
Yeah. And is it true that Hillary Clinton came to visit during your time in South Africa?
She came twice.
Twice.
First time she came with her daughter Chelsea and when she was First Lady. And we had a marvelous visit. She traveled all over South Africa. She gave a magnificent speech at the University of Cape Town. And I have a photograph that I share with you of me introducing her to a very important housing project in a township outside of Cape Town. It was a housing project that was created and led by homeless women who built their own homes. And so we introduced the First Lady there. She actually, laid a few bricks at the housing project. Warm, enthusiastic reception for her. Also, while she was there, we had introduced a couple of months previous to her arrival, Sesame Street into South Africa, working with South African Broadcasting Corporation. And so she and Chelsea taught a lesson in the famous township of Soweto in a primary school of Sesame Street.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. So, Aaron, let's talk a bit more about mentorship, something that I deeply care about. I'm involved with different organizations mentoring students, early career professionals, but especially women of color. And you've recently published a book the Young Black Leader's Guide to Successful Career in International Affairs. And you talk in this book about mentorship, and I want to know more about what inspired you to write this book.
Well, first of all, having been a professional in the foreign affairs arena for 20 plus years, I know there's a lack of diversity in foreign affairs across all of our agencies. And a couple of years ago, two distinguished diplomats, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, who's now our ambassador to the United Nations, and Bill Burns, Ambassador Bill Burns, who's now the director of the CIA. They wrote an op-ed talking about the fact that the lack of diversity in our foreign affairs arena in our agencies was really a weakness in terms of our foreign policy, and that needed to be corrected. And I had had a dream, actually, for over many years of writing a book that would highlight and tell the story of many of the African-American giants that I had worked with at AID and with the State Department, et cetera, the MCC. And so fortunately, I had a wonderful colleague, Professor Jennifer Brinkerhoff at the University of George Washington University, the Elliott School, and she agreed to co-author the book with me. And then at the same time, she brought along one of her brilliant graduate students, Taylor Amos. And so we created an intergenerational dialogue between Taylor and myself to frame the book. But the real story of the book are the stories of these giants, people who have, like Linda Thomas Greenfield, who have really served with distinction and made a real difference in terms of American foreign policy and international development. And so we selected about 30 of these giants, both in business, government, the military, global corporations, to tell their story. And they were so generous. We had hours of interviews with them. We interviewed, for example, the legendary and new president of Spelman College, Dr. Helene Gale,
Of course.
a real trailblazer. And so they shared their stories. And of course, interestingly enough, I had worked with many of these people for many years, and I thought I knew their stories, but actually I didn't know the full story, right? And so we were able to, through their generosity and share their stories and lessons learned. It's a real blueprint for how you can be successful in the foreign affairs arena. And so we're very happy about that book.
Yeah. And you mentioned Helene Gale, president of Spelman College, who's on the board at CSIS. Curious, Aaron, any favorite interviews? 30 giants, of course, so it's hard to pick, but any memorable
You're going to get me in a lot of trouble here. I can't pick out any giant, but I'll mention a couple, right?
Mention a couple, sounds good.
I think certainly our interviews with Linda Thomas Greenfield were magnificent. Helene Gale, Ambassador Johnny Carson, who's now, of course, responsible for carrying out the implementation of the agreements that were arrived at with the recent African summit, and who's a legendary ambassador, served in 4 different African countries, and probably the most knowledgeable person about Africa in the United States. General Barry Price, his distinguished military career. So I know I'm leaving out somebody who's going to be angry with me when they see this recording, but see, you trapped me into that.
That's my fault. You can blame me. That's okay. What I thought was very unique about the book, Aaron, is bringing that multi-generational diversity. I'm curious where the idea came about of bringing in the graduate student, Taylor. Actually, your co-author, Jennifer, that you mentioned, I had the opportunity to meet her a couple of months ago. I did a keynote at GW for the Inclusive Excellence Conference. But I'm curious how the idea came about of that multi-generational piece, because it's very unique.
It was Jennifer's idea because, first of all, we thought about what's our target audience. We're trying to encourage new graduates and mid-career individuals to consider and build upon their career in foreign affairs, in the foreign affairs community. And so we thought the idea of talking to someone like Taylor, who's starting out her career, she's been 3 years into her career in international development, and because she also would have a different generational perspective, right, different from mine and when I started out. And it turned out to be exactly the right format. And it ended up being really a glorious journey, and we were able to highlight lessons learned and lay out a blueprint of what we think the new generation will consider in considering a career in the foreign affairs arena.
Absolutely. And we talked about mentorship, What's linked to that as well is relationship building. One of my favorite stories about you, Aaron, is the time that you spent with the Chicago librarians, right? You were very strategic about getting to know them, and they would save you the new science fiction books, right, for you to read first. And I'm sure that's one of many examples where you've used, again, relationship building for your personal and career growth as well. How has that carried on for the rest of your career?
Well, I think that anyone who's been successful in their career, whether it's in business or government or in the nonprofit world, you know that you have to have a team. And so relationships end up being the most important aspect of having a successful career. And I learned early on in my career that when you're facing challenges and leading an organization, you want to have the smartest people in the room, you know, to paraphrase Hamilton on Broadway, right, in the room where it happens. And you're going to have challenges, and you need to have smart people, smarter than you, in the room to assist you and really make sure that you're responsive in the right way for the particular organization, for the goal you're trying to achieve. So I thought relationships are always important. And not only that, you need to have relationships both internally to your particular organization, but you need to have external. You need to have an external network of people you can turn to, who can enrich your career and provide insights and lessons learned for dealing with challenges, no matter what you might face. And so, to me, relationships are very important. At the same time, I was very fortunate in my career that I had exceptional mentors, people who actually opened the door for me and gave me opportunities to stretch myself to take on challenges that I never would have imagined taking on. And so I've always tried to be a good mentor. I've always tried to lower the ladder to help the people coming up behind me, and I think that's absolutely essential to do. And that's another aspect of our book that we tried to emphasize. We talk a lot about mentoring and mentorship in the book. And all of our giants, by the way, are all superb mentors. Each and every one of them valued this, and it was something that they were eager to talk about.
And giving back, right? Giving back. I'm sure everyone will want to read the book, but if you could just share with us a couple of pieces of advice that you would share with students or early career professionals that are trying to break into the international affairs space.
Well, I think there's a couple of things that are universal and that all of the giants talked about. First of all, the work. Learn your business, right? Become a craftsman in your business. Understand what your colleagues do. When I was at USAID, I wanted to know what healthcare workers, I wanted to know what lawyers did at AID, contract officers. I wanted to know the full body of work because first of all, if you're going to be a leader in the future, you need to understand what the various members of your team actually do and walk in their shoes. So know the work and have respect for the work. Number two, be a risk taker. Raise your hand and volunteer. Right? I mean, the best thing I ever did was volunteer to be a Peace Corps volunteer, right? And it was a high-risk proposition for a young boy growing up on the south side of Chicago. And all of us, all the people in the book, they were all risk takers, right? And secondly, you need to be resilient in your career. You need to understand that you have to bounce back from adversity. No one gets through any career without some adversity and some problems and challenges. So be resilient. Find ways to use your network to help you become resilient. And then the other thing, of course, is you need to be able to have a network. And I mentioned in my previous comments the importance of both an internal and an external network, both for career development and also just to have sounding boards for the things you need to tap people for their expertise. And then the last thing I guess I would say is that embrace failure. Now, that's in a way not something that we support in America. We don't talk about failure. We only talk about success.
That's right.
But the fact of the matter is, and this is something that a great quote from his book on leadership, former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates said. He said that any leader who has not experienced failure in his or her career has not really had formal training in leadership. And I believe that. You know, I know everybody, all of our gens, we've all had experiences and failures in our career that we had to bounce back from. We had to be resilient. That's right. And that's important. So embrace failure. Failure is one of the greatest lessons that you can learn from, and you can use it to shape your career in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. It's connected to sports, Aaron, what we talked about earlier, right? I mean, you have to lose, whether you're games or matches, to be able, again,
you're going to lose.
To be resilient, right? Yeah. I love some of what you've shared, being a risk taker, being resilient, embracing failures. Aaron, you worked in so many different sectors, whether that be public or private, but there was always something at the core of all the work that you did and what you advocated for, which was diversity, right? Why do you believe diversity is so critical across multi-sectors?
Well, first of all, I think the diversity of our nation is one of our great strengths. And let me just read to you a quote from my book, my memoir, Unimagined Life. I've always believed that America's multiracial and multi-ethnic diversity is one of our great strengths. And so it is crucial that we seek ways to pursue diversity across all organizations. I have always tried to be proactive in such efforts throughout my multi-sector career. I just believe, it's really, really essential. And going back to what I mentioned earlier about the very important op-ed that Ambassador Thomas Greenfield and Burns wrote, they talked about the importance of diversity in our foreign affairs agencies. We need to pursue that.
It's a national security imperative.
It is. We need to tap the talent of all Americans.
Absolutely. All Americans, just as you said, and earlier, authentic America, all facets of America, all the diversity of it. Now, Aaron, before we wrap up our conversation, we like to ask our guests 3 questions every episode of Driving Impact, rapid fire style. So are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right.
Okay.
First question. What are 3 words you would use to describe your career?
Let me put it in 3 sections.
Okay, 3 sections. Okay.
All right. I think, first of all, entrepreneurial and open-minded. That's the first part. Second would be a multi-sector career, broad in scope. And then the third would be a team builder who builds diverse teams.
Diverse teams, and that's connected to what we're saying earlier, always advocated for diversity. Aaron, in your opinion, what does it mean to be an American?
Well, I've always been proud to serve America in my various capacities, and this is America's great democratic experiment is historic. I think that we're the most unique in terms of creating a multi-ethnic, multiracial society that works in a democratic fashion, and we need to continue to pursue that. And when I think about America and our journey, this great experiment, I think about something that House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries often says. I want to read that quote to you. Okay. He says that in an interview I saw about a year ago, many times in America, after significant social progress, we confronted backlash. And we emerged from that backlash to continue to make more progress. The framers of the Constitution were not perfect men, and they did not promise a perfect journey, but they did promise a journey towards a more perfect union. And I think that really encapsulates, America's journey, the importance of our democracy, the importance of the shining example that we provide to the world of a successful multi-ethnic, multiracial country.
Yeah. And lastly, Aaron, what is giving you hope right now?
Well, I was privileged to be director of the Peace Corps during the 50th anniversary. And so I traveled to many countries and traveled across many states in celebration of the Peace Corps. And what I saw was inspirational and gives me great hope. I saw primarily young Americans, not all young Americans, but primarily young Americans, teaching in schools, teaching English, teaching STEM classes, working in HIV/AIDS, working in malaria prevention, helping farmers, helping fishermen, promoting women's literacy and girls' literacy, trying to grow small organizations that could provide credit and support to small businesses. And there they were, shoulder to shoulder with their counterparts, speaking the language, embracing the culture, respecting the culture. And when I saw them, I knew that our generation, the baby boomer generation, that's about to pass the baton to this next generation, right? They're ready because they're courageous, they're idealistic, they are innovative, they're tech savvy, and they're prepared to take on the challenges that we face in this world today. And so I'm very optimistic, I'm very hopeful about that.
The next generation of leaders.
The next generation of leaders. They are ready to take the baton on.
Absolutely. Aaron, it's been such a pleasure to chat with you today. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. Thank you for your generous time, and thank you for your service as well.
Well, thank you. This is a pleasure. I'm always delighted to be at CSIS, one of the great institutions in this country. You do so much to promote what America is truly all about. So it's a great pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks again for the beautiful memento. It was great to hear the story as well.
Very good.
Thank you. for joining our conversation with the Honorable Aaron S. Williams on his multi-sectoral career in peacebuilding and diplomacy. Do you want to hear more exclusive stories from policy leaders? Be sure to follow Driving Impact on YouTube, Spotify, or CSIS.org.